The year was 1879, and the world for Caleb Weston had shrunk to the size of his grief. It was a patch of hard scrabble land clawed from the Texas plains, a place where the wind was the only constant companion and the silence was so profound it had weight. His cabin, a relic of some forgotten homesteader's optimism, sagged under the unforgiving sun, its timbers silvered and split like old bones. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of laughter and the lingering scent of a life that was no longer his. A small, smoothed-down rocking horse sat in one corner, shrouded in dust and stillness, a monument to a future that had died with his wife Martha and their boy, Thomas, swept away by the fever 2 winters past. Caleb's days fell into a rhythm of pure survival, a litany of chores that kept his hands busy and his mind blessedly numb. He moved through his life like a man in a dream, his face a mask of stoic indifference carved by loss. He checked his trap lines, mended fences that protected nothing of value, and stared out at the horizon where the sky bled into the bruised earth. He was a man hollowed out, the vital parts of him scooped away, leaving only the shell to carry on. He didn't live on the land. He merely existed upon it, waiting for a finality that was taking its sweet time. It was on a day like any other, under a sky the color of faded denim, that the rhythm broke. He was down by the creek that snaked through the southern edge of his property, its water a muddy trickle after weeks without rain. He'd been checking for tracks, for anything that might promise a meager meal when he saw it. A splash of color against the dun-colored bank, a smear of deep crimson that did not belong. His first thought was a wounded deer, but as he drew closer, his hand resting on the worn grip of the pistol at his hip, the shape resolved itself into something else entirely. It was a woman. She was lying face down, half in the shallow water, her dark hair fanned out like a spill of ink. Her buckskin dress, intricately decorated with beadwork he'd never seen the like of, was torn and stained with mud and blood. A deep, wicked-looking gash marred her side, the flesh around it puckered and angry. She was Comanche, or Kiowa, he couldn't be sure. It didn't matter. To the settlers further east, she was trouble, a danger, a piece of the wildness they sought to tame or eradicate. Every instinct, honed by years of frontier caution and bitter stories, screamed at him to turn around, to walk away and pretend he had seen nothing. Leaving her was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. He stood there for a long moment, the dry wind whispering through the brittle reeds, a sound like 1,000 tiny sighs. He saw the delicate turn of her wrist, the slimness of her form, and something stirred in the cavern of his chest. It was a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who had held his wife's hand and promised her a world of safety, the man who had lifted his son onto his shoulders to see the endless sky. He thought of Martha, her body racked with fever, her life seeping away while he stood helpless. He had been unable to save his own. Cursing himself, the world, and whatever God had forsaken him, Caleb knelt. With a grunt of effort that was more spiritual than physical, he gathered the unconscious woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost frail, and as he lifted her, a low moan escaped her lips. The sound, faint as it was the first sign of life he had truly acknowledged in 2 years. He had just brought the greatest complication imaginable into the heart of his desolate peace. He carried her back to the cabin, his boots kicking up dust that swirled around them in a hazy shroud. The journey felt impossibly long, each step a repudiation of the quiet emptiness he had cultivated. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft surface in the entire dwelling, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at the confounding reality of her presence. A native woman, wounded and unconscious, lay in his bed. The silence of the room was now charged with a new kind of tension, a living, breathing pulse of uncertainty. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his resolve, he went to work. He fetched water from the rain barrel and tore strips from one of Martha's old linen sheets, a sacrilege that sent a sharp pang through him. His hands, usually steady when mending a harness or skinning a rabbit, felt clumsy and large as he gently cleaned the wound on her side. It was deep, a slice from a knife, or perhaps a glancing blow from an arrowhead. It was infected, the skin around it hot to the touch. He did what he could, washing it with boiled water and applying a poultice of yarrow he'd learned about from an old trapper, his movements hesitant and unsure. He had tended livestock, but never a person in this way, not since he pushed the thought away before it could fully form. For 3 days she drifted in a fevered haze. Caleb sat by the cot, a silent, grim-faced guardian. He forced cool water between her cracked lips and changed the dressing on her wound, watching for any sign of change. He found himself studying her face in the dim, shifting light of the cabin. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and a proud, firm jaw, even in unconsciousness. The intricate patterns of the beads on her dress spoke of patience and artistry, a world of meaning he could not comprehend. He was tending to a complete stranger, a woman who would likely see him as an enemy if she were awake, yet he felt a strange, unwelcome sense of responsibility settle over him like a heavy wool blanket. On the 4th morning, he awoke to find her eyes open. They were dark and bottomless, and they were fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. There was no fear in them, not at first. There was only a sharp, intelligent appraisal, a sizing up of the man and the situation. He sat frozen on his stool across the small room, the tin cup of coffee halfway to his lips. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and deep-seated suspicion. He slowly lowered his cup and made a simple, open-handed gesture meant to convey peace. Her gaze didn't soften. It flickered to the door, to the rifle leaning against the wall, then back to him. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of threat and opportunity. She tried to sit up, a sharp gasp of pain cutting the movement short as the wound in her side pulled. She fell back against the pillow, her jaw tightening. Caleb rose slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He ladled some thin broth from the pot, simmering over the fire, into a bowl. He approached the cot as one would a wary wolf. He held out the bowl. She stared at it, then at him, her eyes narrowed. He simply stood there, offering it, waiting. After a long, tense minute, her gaze dropped to the bowl again. With a slow, reluctant movement, she reached out a hand and took it. Her fingers brushed his, and the brief contact was like a spark of static electricity in the dead air. She drank the broth, never taking her eyes off him, a prisoner accepting rations from her jailer. Thus began their strange, silent cohabitation. They did not speak, for they had no shared words. Their communication was a sparse, elemental language of gesture and observation. A nod of his head toward the water bucket, a faint inclination of hers to accept a piece of bread. He went about his chores, always conscious of her presence, of her dark eyes, following his every move. When she was strong enough to leave the cot, she would sit in the chair by the hearth, her back straight, her hands occupied with repairing the torn beadwork on a leather pouch she'd had with her. The rhythmic, patient work of her needle seemed a quiet act of defiance, a reclamation of her identity in this alien place. Caleb found himself watching her, too. He observed the way she moved, with a fluid grace that returned as her strength did. He saw the subtle shifts in her expression, a tightening of her lips when a coyote howled too close, a far-off look in her eyes as she stared into the flames. He began to see not an Indian, not a Comanche, but a woman who was healing, who was resilient, and who was as utterly alone in the world as he was. One evening, a storm rolled in, a violent tantrum of thunder and lightning that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Caleb was checking the shutters when a particularly loud clap of thunder made him jump. A small, involuntary sound escaped him. When he turned, he saw her watching him, and for the first time there was something other than suspicion in her eyes. It looked almost like understanding. He felt a flush of embarrassment and turned away, busying himself with the fire. Later that night, he was running a hand over the dusty rocking horse in the corner, his back to her. The grief, always lurking just beneath the surface, ambushed him in the storm-charged quiet. His shoulders slumped, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled for a moment. He did not realize he was crying, not until he felt a light touch on his arm. He spun around, startled. She stood there, her face softened in the firelight, her eyes holding a deep and sorrowful wisdom. She looked from him to the little horse, and her expression was one of profound empathy. She said nothing, but she didn't need to. In that single, silent gesture, she had seen the core of his pain. She had seen the ghosts that haunted the cabin and the man who lived within it. From that night on, the quality of the silence between them changed. It was no longer a void of mistrust, but a shared space of quiet companionship. The tension eased, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. He started leaving wildflowers on the table for her, small bunches of purple verbena and Indian paintbrush he found on his walks. He didn't know why he did it. He just knew that the splash of color against the drab wood of the cabin felt right. In return, she began to teach him. She would point to the water bucket and say a word, a soft, flowing sound. Pa. He would repeat it, his own voice clumsy and rough. Pa. She would give a small, approving nod. Fire was kutsu, rabbit was tavo. Each word was a thread, weaving a delicate bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. He learned her name was Winona. Her healing progressed. The angry gash on her side slowly closed, leaving a puckered silver scar. She began to help with small tasks, her movements efficient and sure. She showed him how to set better snares, how to read the subtle signs of the land he had lived on but never truly seen. He, in turn, showed her how to work the small hand-cranked grinder for the corn, an object that seemed to fascinate her. They would sometimes share a small smile over a misspoken word or a clumsy gesture. Laughter was still a foreign currency, but a gentle amusement began to bloom in the spaces between them. Caleb felt a thawing inside him, a slow, aching return of feeling to limbs long frozen. He was still a man defined by what he had lost, but Winona's presence had become a quiet anchor in his drifting existence. She was a reason to stoke the fire, to hunt for more than just his own subsistence, to be present in the world. He had taken her in to save her life, but he was beginning to realize she was, in her own quiet way, saving his. The fragile peace they had built was shattered on a blistering afternoon in late summer. 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the cabin, their silhouettes stark against the searing blue sky. They were not cowboys or homesteaders. They rode with the lazy arrogance of men who took what they wanted and feared no reprisal. Caleb's blood ran cold. He recognized the man in the lead, Garrett Donovan, a ruthless opportunist who led a band of ex-militia men and bounty hunters, vultures who preyed on the fringes of the territory. "Inside," he said to Winona, the single word sharp with urgency. "Don't make a sound." She saw the look on his face and disappeared into the shadows of the cabin without a word of protest, her movements swift and silent as a cat. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the sun, his posture deceptively relaxed, his hand never far from his sidearm. Donovan and his men rode down, their horses kicking up plumes of dust. They reined in before the cabin, their eyes sweeping over the poor homestead with undisguised contempt. "Weston," Donovan greeted, a humorless smile twisting his lips. He was a big man with a florid face and pale, cold eyes. "Still hiding out here with the lizards and the ghosts?" "Donovan," Caleb replied, his voice flat. "What do you want?" "Just passing through," Donovan said, his gaze lingering on the cabin door. "Heard some commotion out this way a few weeks back. A little skirmish. We were tracking a small party of Comanche renegades, lost one of them, a woman." He leaned forward on his saddle horn, his eyes narrowing. "You ain't seen a stray squaw wandering about, have you? Wounded, maybe?" Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his face a blank mask. "Haven't seen anyone. Been just me out here." Donovan grunted, unconvinced. One of his men pointed a grimy finger toward the side of the cabin. "What's that?" Caleb's gaze followed. A small strip of the linen he had used for bandages had snagged on a nail near the rain barrel, fluttering in the breeze. It was a small thing, an insignificant detail, but in this tense standoff, it was as damning as a confession. "That's my business," Caleb said, his voice dropping low and hard. Donovan's smile widened. It was a predator's smile. "Is that so? We heard this particular squaw was important, that her daddy is some big chief. Important enough that there might be a handsome reward for her return, or for proof that she ain't coming back at all." He looked Caleb up and down. "A man living like this could use a reward, Weston." "I told you," Caleb repeated, his voice like flint. "There's no one here. You'd best be on your way." For a long moment, Donovan just stared at him, the silence thick with menace. Caleb did not flinch. He was no longer the hollowed-out man he had been. He was a man with something to protect. Finally, Donovan shrugged, a theatrical gesture of nonchalance. "All right, Weston. Have it your way." He wheeled his horse around. "But we ain't going far. If we find out you're lying to us, well, this little shack of yours burns real easy." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of dread hanging in the air. Caleb watched them go, his hand clenched into a fist. The confrontation he had dreaded was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. He went back inside. Winona emerged from the shadows, her face grim. She had heard everything. Her eyes met his, and in that shared look, they were no longer a man and a woman from different worlds. They were allies, bound together by a common threat. The world he had tried to shut out had come for them both. The next day passed in a state of high alert. Caleb and Winona worked in near silence, but it was a new kind of silence, one of shared purpose and heightened senses. Every gust of wind, every distant bird call, sounded like the approach of riders. He cleaned and oiled his rifle and pistol, his movements precise and economical. She, in turn, found a hunting bow and a quiver of arrows he'd taken in trade long ago and forgotten in the small barn. She tested the string, her fingers moving with familiar grace, and began sharpening the arrowheads on a whetstone. The sight of her, so focused and capable, stirred a deep, protective instinct in him that was fierce and absolute. He had brought her in out of a reluctant flicker of decency, a ghost of the man he once was. Now, the thought of letting any harm come to her was unbearable. She had become more than a responsibility. She had become the center of his world, the force that had pulled him back from the precipice of despair. He was no longer just protecting her. He was defending the flicker of hope she had ignited within him. They knew Donovan would be back. It was not a question of if, but when. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, Caleb saw movement on the ridge again. This time they weren't trying to be subtle. They rode down toward the cabin, fanning out, their intentions clear. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice low. He took up his position near the door, rifle in hand. The cabin, once his sanctuary of grief, had become a fortress. "Caleb," Winona said, her voice soft but firm. He turned. She held the bow in one hand, an arrow nocked in the other. Her eyes were blazing. She gestured toward the back window, which offered a line of sight to the side of the cabin. A silent question, an offer of alliance. He gave a single, sharp nod. They were in this together. The pounding on the door was heavy and splintering. "Weston, we know she's in there. Send her out, and we'll let you live." Donovan's voice was a drunken roar. Caleb remained silent, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. He was not giving her up. He would not. The world could go to hell. The flimsy wooden door shuddered as a heavy boot slammed against it. Then again. With a crack of splintering wood, the door flew open, and one of Donovan's men stumbled in, a pistol in his hand. Caleb didn't hesitate. His rifle roared, the sound deafening in the small space. The man crumpled to the floor. Chaos erupted. Gunfire shattered the evening quiet. A bullet tore through the wall next to Caleb's head, showering him with splinters. He fired back through the doorway, forcing the others to take cover. He could hear Donovan shouting orders, his voice raw with fury. Suddenly, a scream of pain came from outside. to the right, a sharp, guttural cry. Caleb risked a glance. One of Donovan's men was on the ground, clutching his leg, an arrow protruding from his thigh. From the darkened back window, Winona had fired her first shot. Enraged, Donovan himself charged the doorway, firing wildly. Caleb ducked as bullets chewed up the wall behind him. He was pinned down. He could see Donovan reloading, preparing for another rush. It was over. He was out of time. Then, a flash of movement. Winona was no longer at the window. She had moved through the cabin as silently as a shadow. In her hand was the skinning knife from Caleb's belt, which he'd left on the table. As Donovan stepped through the door, his eyes fixed on Caleb, Winona surged from the side. She was not a princess, not a delicate flower. She was a warrior, her face a mask of cold fury, her entire being focused on a single point. She drove the knife into Donovan's side, under his arm, with a powerful upward thrust. The big man roared, a sound of shock and agony, his pistol discharging into the floor as he staggered back. His eyes, wide with disbelief, found hers. He tried to raise his gun, but his strength failed him. He collapsed in the doorway, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before slumping into stillness. The last man, seeing his leader fall and hearing his companion's cries, lost his nerve. He fired one last wild shot into the night, and then scrambled onto his horse, fleeing into the darkness as fast as the terrified animal could carry him. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the low moans of the man with the arrow in his leg. The cabin was a wreck, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Caleb looked at Winona. She stood over Donovan's body, the knife still in her hand, her chest heaving. Her eyes met his across the ruined space. The bond that had grown in silence, nurtured by small kindnesses, had just been forged anew in blood and fire. He had stood to protect her, and in the end, she had saved his life. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gently took the knife from her trembling hand, his fingers closing over hers. In the immediate aftermath, they moved with a grim, shared purpose. Caleb bound the wounded man's leg and, at dawn, sent him away on his horse with a stark warning never to return. They dragged Donovan's body and that of his companion far from the cabin and buried them in shallow, unmarked graves. There were no words for such work, only the grim necessity of it. Afterward, they returned to the cabin and began to set it right. He mended the broken door while she cleaned the floor, erasing the last physical traces of the violence. When the work was done, they sat together by the fire, the silence between them no longer a barrier, but a deep, shared understanding. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the strength and courage that burned so brightly beneath her quiet exterior. He reached out and gently touched the scar on her side, the wound he had tended. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The words felt inadequate, a pebble tossed into a vast canyon of feeling. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she offered him a full, genuine smile. It transformed her face, lighting it from within. She placed her hand over his. "Caleb," she said, his name a soft melody on her tongue. It was all that needed to be said. In that moment, the ghosts in the cabin finally seemed to recede, and the little home felt less like a tomb and more like a beginning. A week later, a new group of riders appeared on the horizon. But these were different. They rode with a proud, disciplined grace, their bearing noble. There were more than 20 of them, their faces painted, their lances adorned with eagle feathers that danced in the wind. They were Comanche, and they rode as if they owned the land, because once they had. Caleb's hand went to his pistol, but Winona placed a calming hand on his arm. "My people," she said softly. They watched as the war party approached and halted a respectful distance from the cabin. One man, older than the rest, with a face like a weathered rock and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 moons, dismounted and walked forward alone. He was magnificent, his buckskin shirt covered in elaborate beadwork that put even Winona's to shame. He was clearly a man of immense authority. Winona stepped out to meet him, and Caleb followed, standing a few paces behind her. She spoke to the man in their tongue, her voice clear and strong. She spoke for a long time, her hands gesturing to the cabin, to Caleb, to the scar on her side. The older man listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, his gaze fell upon Caleb. It was a look that seemed to penetrate his very soul, weighing and measuring him. Caleb stood his ground, meeting the chief's gaze without aggression, without fear. He had done what was right. He had nothing to hide. The chief spoke to Winona, his voice a low rumble. She turned to Caleb. "This is my father, Wapasha," she said. "He is a great war chief of the Nokoni band. I have told him everything. I told him you found me when I was left for dead. I told him you tended my wound and gave me shelter. I told him you protected me from the men who attacked my escort and that you fought for me." Chief Wapasha took a step forward and spoke directly to Caleb in broken, heavily accented English. "You saved my daughter, my firstborn daughter. You are not like other white men." It was then that Caleb understood. The fine beadwork, the deference of her people, the bounty Donovan had spoken of. Winona was not just any woman. She was the daughter of a powerful Chifa princess, in the language of his world. He had harbored royalty in his humble, broken-down shack. Wapasha raised a hand, and one of his warriors led forward 2 stunning horses, a fiery Mustang and a gentle-looking mare, their saddles and bridles decorated with silver and turquoise. "A gift," Wapasha said, "for the life of my daughter." Caleb looked from the magnificent horses to Winona. Her eyes were full of a deep, sorrowful light. Her people had come. It was time for her to go home. The realization landed in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy. The fragile world they had built together was about to be dismantled. She walked back to him, her expression torn. "I must go, Caleb," she whispered. "They are my family. My life is with them." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump forming in his throat. He had known, of course, that she could not stay forever. But knowing it and living it were 2 very different things. He had just found his way back to the light, and now the light was leaving. "I understand," he finally managed to say. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small objector little bird he had whittled from a piece of scrapwood during the long, quiet evenings. It was crude, but the lines were smooth and graceful. He pressed it into her hand. "So you remember." Tears welled in her eyes. She clutched the bird tightly, and then, from around her neck, she removed a small, beaded pouch, the one she had so painstakingly repaired. "And you?" she said, pressing it into his hand. "So you do not forget." She turned and walked to her father, mounting the mare with a fluid grace. She looked back at him one last time, her gaze holding all the unspoken words, all the shared moments, all the quiet understanding. It held the terror of the storm, the warmth of the fire, the fury of the fight, and the gentle peace of their shared silence. Caleb Weston stood on the porch of his small cabin and watched as Winona, lost princess of the Comanche, rode away with her people, a proud, straight figure receding into the vast, indifferent landscape. He watched until they were just specks on the horizon, and then nothing at all. The silence that descended was profound, but it was different now. It was not the dead, empty silence of grief. It was a quiet filled with the echo of her presence, with the memory of her strength and the gift of her companionship. He opened his hand and looked at the beaded pouch, its intricate patterns a map of a world he had briefly touched. He had nursed a wounded stranger back to health, and in doing so, she had done the same for him. He was still alone, in his cabin on the edge of nowhere. But he was no longer a ghost. He had fought for something again. He had cared for someone again. The future was still an unknown country, but for the first time in a long, long time, he felt ready to face it. The wind whispered through the plains, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a promise.